Hello everybody, today we're continuing where we left off last week and rating each of Redeemed Zoomer's responses to every atheist argument. Next argument.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of god exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
This is a really good point, and it's a shame that this is the first argument we're starting off with in the second half, because it relates to something I mentioned in the first half, which is basically that Zoomer actually contradicts his own logic here earlier on. I already gave him a 0 out of 10 for that. The good news is, having given him a 0 out of 10 for earlier contradicting this logic, I can now give him due praise for presenting the logic here, because it is 100% correct logic. A common analogy I make is that there are several different theories of evolution, but does that mean that it makes sense for a young Earth creationist to say, well, you reject every conception of the theory of evolution except one, I just reject one more than you do? Obviously not. Or what if 10 people are arguing about how many sweets there are in a jar? One says he thinks there's about 101, another says 102, another says 97, and then finally one of them says he thinks there's no sweets in the jar. Now, there are clearly sweets in the jar, but the person who says 0 declares, hey, you will reject 8 numbering systems of the sweets in the jar, I'm just rejecting one more numbering than you. That would be silly. There are many analogies that can show the flaw in this logic. I reject infinite, hypothetical conceptions of God, but that doesn't mean that the difference between me believing in God versus not believing in a God is in any way diminished. So good job, Zoomer, 9 out of 10, next argument.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
I think this is a good response made quite poorly. The way I would make the argument is to say that we know the natural world is causal, so there cannot be a natural cause for the natural world, because otherwise that natural cause would itself be part of the natural world, which would thus be causal and require a cause. But to begin a chain, you need an uncaused cause, and for something to be uncaused, it would have to be outside the natural causal world, thus it would have to be supernatural. Since the supernatural world is not natural, we've no reason to think it has the same causality we observe in the natural world. Thus, a supernatural being doesn't necessarily require a cause in the way that we know the natural world does. Zoomer then tags onto this, though, that it doesn't make sense for the uncaused causes to be a random impersonal force. This isn't relevant to the argument, so I don't know why he includes it. Overall, I'm only going to give a 7 out of 10 for not really making the argument as effectively as he could. He sort of just makes it sound like special pleading, rather than what it actually is, which is a necessary extension of the logic of scientific observable reality. Next argument.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
Okay, this seems very similar to the argument in part 1 about there being no scientific evidence for God. I think Zoomer's response here would make more sense to their response to the claim that believing in God is unscientific, in such case pointing out what Zoomer points out here, which is that belief in God actually contains within it certain presuppositions that facilitate and underpin scientific inquiry would be a valid point. 6 out of 10 for the response, with a few points knocked off for not really making it a response to the right argument. Next argument.
God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet. Well, actually, God is the reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
I think God of the Gaps arguments are good against people who argue for a God of the Gaps, but I don't argue for any such God. There are things that science has not yet explained, but I still believe those things came about through scientific processes. Within this context, Zoomer is right to point out that an intelligent Christian should believe that God explains everything, and that science explains most things in the natural physical world, with the sole exception of conspicuous miracles recorded in the Bible. So yeah, Zoomer is presenting a good argument here, but unfortunately there are people out there who do literally argue that anything that can't be explained by science must be explained by God, and those people are idiots. Fortunately, Zoomer here isn't an idiot, so he gets an 8 out of 10. Next argument.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will.
Barely a response, 4 out of 10. Next argument.
Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you.
Okay, but why can't God destroy the evil within us without destroying us? Is God incapable of that? This is a very deficient response, 3 out of 10.
Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
This response is better. I think if human beings were perfect and wonderful and weren't doing all sorts of conspicuous evil things all the time, then we could perhaps be quite indignant about evil. In reality, we're very much quite the opposite, constantly doing dodgy stuff, so it's not surprising that the world isn't perfect. Still, I think that the problem of evil is a very complex issue with no clear solutions, so I don't know if Zuma's response here is the whole story. I think it's only just about sufficient as a response, so I'm only going to give it a 5. Next argument.
Well, animals don't sin, so why do they suffer? Well, the Bible says all things will be restored, so if God is good, we can assume that they will be compensated.
This argument is markedly worse simply by dint of being more speculative, except to call it speculative is a bit generous because Redeemed Zuma doesn't even begin to speculate how this compensation might occur. Is he suggesting that all animals that have ever suffered and died will be brought back to life and experience some kind of bliss in the new earth? If so, what kind of compensation is appropriate for an animal that was eaten alive? Technically, there's no objective sense in which this argument fails because it's so sparse on details, but being that it's so speculative, I can't give it more than a 4 out of 10. Next argument.
How do you know that God isn't evil instead? Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light, evil is just a lack of good, and for good to be objective it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I don't know what Zuma means in saying that evil is just a lack of good. That seems logically false and non-biblical, if not actively unbiblical. It seems pretty obvious that I could do no good works, and I could do evil works. Doing evil works make me more evil, and doing good works make me more good, and doing no good works and no evil works makes me pretty neutral. I'm not even sure why Zuma says this because it doesn't seem necessary for the next part of his argument, which is that God must necessarily be objectively good. Now, meta-ethics around divinity is very complex, but I don't blame anybody for being entirely unconvinced by Zuma's argument here. But more to the point, I think the real concern is what if God's morality is wildly out of sync with our own, such that God believes that torturing people for eternity for fun is a good thing? How do we know that's not God's moral standard? Personally, if I find out God divinely and objectively declares torturing people for fun for all eternity to be morally good, then that this is objectively true because God is the one true standard for morality won't be much of a comfort to me as I'm being tortured. So Zuma's answer here seems to miss the key point. 3 out of 10. Next argument.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself or that he can contradict himself.
Finally, we're back to some good arguments. Of course, it should go without saying that God's attributes not self-contradicting is implied by the attributes themselves. Finding self-contradictions in God's attributes are basically just meme arguments and an exercise in futility because all you're doing is helping to refine what we mean in talking about God's attributes, since again, it goes without saying that we don't mean that they contradict. 9 out of 10, next argument.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
Uh-oh, we're back to the problem of evil. I've already said that this issue is complex, and just saying that it's so God can be glorified in defeating it is just a woefully deficient answer. It creates the question of why not have there be even more evil so God could be even more good? If the amount of evil doesn't make triumphing over it any more good, then why not have only a small amount of evil, instead of the huge amount we in fact see? I think there are answers to these questions, but to me it's clear that the problem of evil especially is where this whole quick rebuttal thing really falls apart. 4 out of 10, next argument.
Religion is just wishful thinking. Well, if that were true, then the Bible wouldn't be all about how much we all suck.
This is a generally good point. Obviously there are positives with religion. The idea of an afterlife of eternal bliss is a lot better than an eternity of nothing, but it's definitely true that religion makes demands of us such that it doesn't make sense to say that it's wishful thinking. If I could invent my own religion based just on my wishes, it would be different from Christianity. 7 out of 10, next argument.
Psychology explains why you believe in God. So what? If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him.
This makes sense, but it doesn't disprove the atheist argument that people believe in God for psychological reasons, so it basically just leaves things pretty even. If God exists, there'd be psychological reasons people are inclined to believe in him, because God made it that way. If God doesn't exist, then psychological reasons explain naturally why belief in God came about despite him not existing. 6 out of 10, next argument.
Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals. Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real.
Good point. One thing I'd add would be that this argument assumes a dualism where spiritual experiences would not have any sort of natural physiological component, but that's not really how the Christian conception of the material world works, so it's based on a faulty premise. 8 out of 10, next argument.
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
I don't know if this is even true. Either way, the argument is pretty silly. Even if drugs could imitate a genuine spiritual experience, that wouldn't prove that spiritual experience isn't real. The existence of a convincing counterfeit doesn't prove that the real version isn't authentic. 6 out of 10, next argument.
The story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus or some other ancient character. Okay, dude, that's a Reddit atheist-level myth. Even atheist scholars know that that's silly.
This is a hard argument to engage with because you have to choose how seriously you want to take an obviously stupid argument. Like, to properly debunk this, you'd need to go through all the similarities and show that they're nonsense, but I do think that basically saying that nobody who's looked into it takes this argument seriously is sufficient, and if people want to continue believing this is actually a good argument, then that's just embarrassing for them. Side note, I remember when I was an atheist slowly realizing that this argument is wrong, and not everything I see repeated on atheist forums is automatically correct. 7 out of 10, next argument.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
The issue here is that Zuma doesn't engage with the idea that faith means believing something without evidence, which of course is contrary to logic. When we eat food, we have evidence from past experiences that it's not poisoned. Believing for no reason that food is poisoned would obviously be irrational. Love is also based on evidence. If there was no evidence that your wife loved you, maybe you should doubt her love. He introduces the idea of scientific proof, but this really isn't about science. It's about having some sort of reason to believe what you believe. Faith defined as trust is good, but faith defined as belief without evidence is bad. You need reasons to believe things, kids. 4 out of 10, next argument.
Evolution proves God didn't create the world. Well, not necessarily. God often works through natural processes in the Bible, and for all of church history there have been prominent Christian theologians who have had a more metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, even well over 1,000 years before Darwin existed.
Good response. Especially good to point out that a non-literal interpretation of Genesis isn't just some ad hoc response to the theory of evolution. 9 out of 10, next argument.
Christianity only spread because of military conquest. Well, eventually they did do military conquest, but for the first 300 years of Christianity it was illegal, and it took over the Roman Empire despite that because of how popular it became.
I think this point could have been made even stronger, such as the fact that atheist scholar Bart Ehrman has argued that Christianity would have taken over Rome even if it had never been officially adopted. Also, the fact is that a lot of the contemporary spread of Christianity hasn't been accompanied by colonialism. For example, while colonialism did allow Christianity to spread, Christianity has continued to spread after colonialism and has also spread to places that were never colonized. Christianity has been growing in Japan, South Korea, and China without any colonization. The only country in that region that has successfully kept Christianity out is North Korea, which is in fact a heavily militarized country. And even though Africa was colonized, a lot of the evangelism in Africa has happened since colonialism, so Zuma is right to call this argument out, but he could have made the point even stronger. 7 out of 10, next argument.
Constantine invented what we now know of as Christianity. Again, Reddit atheist-level myth. Atheists can do better than that. Listen to an actual scholar.
I mean, Constantine was instrumental in the creation of the Catholic religion, but of course he didn't create the Christian religion, which was created by Jesus and then Paul. 6 out of 10, next argument.
If Christianity is true, why are there so many denominations of it? Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
This is very similar to the question of whether it discounts religion that many different gods are said to exist. Just because there are a variety of opinions within a wider belief doesn't mean the wider belief is false. Now, you could argue that if God exists, he would want his whole church to agree, but I don't see why. God would only need his whole church to agree on the important stuff, and the important stuff is definitionally agreed on by the whole church because that's what makes you part of the church. 7 out of 10, next argument.
There's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. Well, that's not true. There's the ancient Jewish historian Josephus who wrote about Jesus, and he's one of the reasons why even secular scholars know Jesus historically existed.
This is a good response, but I'd also stress that the Bible is just a collection of the most historically reputable and substantial accounts of Jesus' life, so of course there'd be few accounts of him outside the Bible. If I tried to collect together all the accounts about the life of Winston Churchill and put them all together in one massive book, then there aren't going to be many accounts about him that can't be found in this book. But does that mean he doesn't exist? Obviously not. 7 out of 10. Next, and final argument.
You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you? Yes.
Meme response, 3 out of 10. I mean, I guess I'm being sort of mean, but there are some genuine questions as to why God created so much seemingly superfluous space and time just to have a relationship with human beings on one tiny planet for, thus far, just a few thousand years, and obviously Zuma isn't engaging with that. Overall, if my calculations are correct, Zuma did get an overall rating of just over 6 out of 10, which means he narrowly scraped by with a pass grade. Well done him.